In the month of October, Russian forces advanced 478 square kilometers into Ukrainian territory. That's the most in a single month since March 2022 in the opening weeks of the invasion. That's a problem, not just for the Ukrainians, not just for Europe, but for us here in the United States. And today we're going to talk about why. Today we're going to answer the question, what does a Russian victory look like? Because honestly, I kind of think we dropped the ball on this one. To help me out, I'll be leaning on two experts to help lay out what we could expect if Russia wins this war, as well as some historical examples that could give us a glimpse of what's to come.
The first America First movement was in the late 1930s, and it was an argument about why the United States should stay out of World War II, because that was far away. It was none of our business. And we learned on Pearl Harbor, when the attack happened at Pearl Harbor, that was a fantasy then, and it's even more a fantasy now. The United States cannot exist in a world where we are isolated and alone, and a world where large revisionist powers can go on the march like they did in the 1930s.
That was Dr. Colin Kahl, who was kind enough to join me a few days ago to share his thoughts for this video. Dr. Kahl, who we'll hear more from here in a bit, is a political scientist who served as Vice President Biden's National Security Advisor from 2014 to 2017 and as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from 2021 to 2023. So yeah, a little bit of an expert in this particular field. Hey, real quick, Dr. Kahl and Ms. Horne, who we'll hear from here in a minute, agreed to participate in this video not because of me, but because of you. Look, it's awesome to be able to interview people like this, but the only reason it's possible is because you all are here. I mean, you all know this, but to just hammer it home, you're a serious audience, and I just think it's cool to kind of step back and realize that senior officials are interested in doing something on YouTube because they know the quality of people they're able to reach here. So, you all are awesome. Keep doing what you're doing. Now, when Russia kicked off their full-scale invasion in February of 2022, much of the world rallied to Ukraine's support. Videos of Russian tanks rolling into Ukraine were plastered across all Western media, and the response here in the United States was pretty uniform. Citizens across the country and politicians on both sides of the political spectrum sounded off in agreement. This blatant act of aggression cannot be allowed to stand. In the midst of that pro-Ukraine sentiment, our government began to put together a response that included significant aid to Ukraine to help them stop and beat back the Russian advance. The first aid package passed through Congress with broad bipartisan support in March, with the House voting 361 to 69 and the Senate 86 to 11, both in favor. Look, we don't often see that level of bipartisan support for really anything here in American politics, and personally, I think that allowed the government to kind of stop explaining why this war was important for us here in the U.S. and how it'll affect us even if we choose to sit it out entirely. All right, so what's happening over there is closer to us than we often think, but to get an idea of how a Russian victory will impact the United States, it's important to first consider what that would mean for Ukraine, and it wouldn't be pretty. Let's turn to another expert here, former National Security Council Spokesperson, Emily Horne.
First of all, there's going to be no accountability for the war crimes that Russia has committed. No accountability for the over 15,000 civilians who have died in Russian drone attacks and missile strikes and firefights. No accountability for the thousands of women and girls, boys and men who have been sexually assaulted or subjected to rape as a tool of war in Russian-controlled territories. No accountability for the 20,000 children that Putin has kidnapped and forcibly relocated from Ukraine to live with Russian families as part of an ethnic cleansing campaign. And no accountability for the people who have lived under occupation, have resisted occupation, and who have waited for the world to stand up for them. So that's one. What's going to happen to the Ukrainian people? Let's also think about what a Russian-controlled Ukraine is going to mean for the world geopolitically. So Russia, as you know, has long been interested in controlling Ukrainian territory and the Ukrainian population for its own strategic ambitions. Why? Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world. Over 70% of Ukrainian territory is farmland. It's one of the world's largest producers of wheat, of soy, of oil, of barley, crops that are transmitted around the world to feed people on other continents far, far away from Ukraine. And we actually saw a major impact on global hunger immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine when the spring harvest in 2022 was impacted by fighting. So if Russia controls those food supplies, if Russia controls Ukraine's ports in the Black Sea, if Russia controls a strategic land that is between its territory and the rest of Europe, then Russia, Vladimir Putin, gains a major geopolitical advantage and a whole bunch more tools that he can use to try to exert influence and power over the rest of the world and bend it to his will.
None of that should really come as a shock to anyone, but I think at times it's easy to look past what the Ukrainians will endure if Russia is successful. These are people fighting for their lives, sacrificing everything they have to avoid falling under Russian control. In fact, we have an ongoing fundraiser to try to get some much-needed trucks to these warriors fighting back Russian forces every day at the front. I've teamed up with Help 99, a registered 501c3, to put all this together. They're pros and have been doing this for years at this point. Right now, we've got a few patches you can pick up or donate more to add custom text to the vehicles or even opt to deliver one yourself to the Ukrainian armed forces. Right now, we've raised over $15,000 in a few weeks and we're well on our way to getting these warfighters what they need. Link is in the description and pinned comment if interested in contributing. Now, on that note, there's a real argument here that Ukraine is sort of holding back Russian aggression from moving further into Europe. This one's easy to write off at times because people immediately look at NATO versus the state of the Russian military today and say, Putin would get crushed. His army's bogged down in eastern Ukraine. What chance would he have against the unified NATO alliance? But that argument is actually missing a key component. Russia pushing further into Europe isn't about their expecting battlefield success. It's that Putin needs war to stay in power.
So he's now going to turn his sights to the rest of Europe. He's going to look at non-NATO, non-EU countries. He's going to look at Georgia. He's going to look at Moldova. And he's also going to start thinking about Poland, about the Baltics, about the eastern flank of NATO. And here's why. In order for Vladimir Putin to continue exerting control over the Russian people, he has to be in an existential war with the West. This is the whole basis of public support for his leadership. I alone can keep you safe. I alone can defend us against expansion and NATO encroachment onto Russian territory. To do that, he has to keep fighting. He will not stop with Ukraine. He will go into Georgia and Moldova, where he has already started to meddle in their elections and really interfere with their domestic politics. He will turn his sights toward NATO's eastern flank.
Now, we also have to consider the non-military means that Russia could pursue. We're all pretty familiar at this point with Russian hybrid warfare, and it's no secret that Russia has significant cyber, information, and sabotage capabilities that could easily be ramped up at a moment's notice.
That Putin will just keep going. And even if it's not his army rolling over other countries, he would certainly be emboldened to undermine the security of those countries. So it would be a dagger pointed at the rest of Europe. And because most of the rest of Europe is in NATO, an alliance to which we have an ironclad Article 5 security guarantee, it could also bring Russia and the United States directly into conflict.
A Russian victory doesn't end in Ukraine. Not only is it likely to continue in some capacity throughout Europe, but Putin succeeding in his invasion of Ukraine risks pulling all of us into an even larger global conflict sometime in the near future. This is one where we have a historical event to point to, a time where an aggressor nation went unchecked, and before we knew it, American soldiers were fighting and dying on foreign soil to try to stop and roll back its advance.
I'm a political science professor. I think about international history. And, one of the darkest moments of international history was the period between World War I and World War II, where the United States, the world's greatest democracy, turned inward. It splintered in its relationships with other democratic countries like Great Britain and France. The free world fell apart. And very large authoritarian countries with revisionist and imperial ambitions to carve out spheres of influence. So the Nazis in Europe, Imperial Japan in Asia, Mussolini's Italy in the Mediterranean and North Africa went on the march. And the free world didn't stand united against those authoritarian powers. And it dragged the world into the most devastating conflict in human history. Tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people died as a consequence of World War II. So look, I don't want the 2030s to look like the 1930s.
Now look, personally, I do think the Putin-Hitler 1939 argument can be a bit overplayed at times, and the word appeasement has actually gotten kind of an unnecessarily bad rap. I mean, there are plenty of times throughout history where aggression was met with a diplomatic solution and mankind averted a larger conflict. However, we've got this big glaring example of what happens when we miscalculate. We end up in a global war with millions of dead, but it doesn't have to be that way.
As long as Ukraine continues to receive economic and military support, the Russians cannot win. And the two primary objectives of ensuring that Ukraine remains a independent, democratic, sovereign nation, and that the war is seen as a strategic failure can be achieved, but only if we stick with Ukraine.
Right now, we're seeing Russia advance at a pace not seen since the early days of the war, and alongside that are loud and sometimes notable voices saying that a Russian victory is inevitable. They can't be beaten, that any support for Ukraine is a wasted effort. So that raises the question, is it within our ability here in the United States to affect this outcome in a way favorable to us, to Europe, and of course, to Ukraine?
Even at the height of its military power at the outset of the war, Russia couldn't absorb all of Ukraine, right? The tenacity, the spirit, The capability of the Ukrainians is remarkable. They've received a tremendous amount of support from the United States, but also 50 other countries around the world, because so many people around the world understand how important it is to stand up for Ukraine.
Sometimes I think the idea of Ukraine surviving this war is confused with the collapse of a nuclear-armed Russian state. Like somehow there's no middle ground we have to choose. Either Russia wins, takes over Ukraine, and we all sit around and hope they stop there, or Ukraine maintains its sovereignty and one of the largest countries on earth enters into some sort of civil war with nuclear weapons freely trading hands. Put simply, that's a false dilemma, a type of fallacy designed to paint something as black and white when there are actually countless shades of gray. An end to this war can be brought about so long as it's done in the right way.
What we need to do is create the conditions where he has a graceful off-ramp, and that this can be resolved in a way that lets him save some face and gives the control of Ukraine back to the Ukrainian government and its people. Wars don't end because everyone suddenly wakes up and decides to stop fighting. Wars end because one side assesses that they can no longer win.
So while this war is going on over there, its outcome will have a serious impact on us here. And my goal isn't to argue that the Ukraine war needs to be the top priority for all Americans, not at all. Instead, I think it's worth considering from time to time what a Russian victory would mean for our world going forward. Because no matter how you feel about this conflict, that's a world that you, I, and our children will be forced to live in. But that's all I've got for now. Thank you again to Dr. Kahl and Ms. Horne for taking the time to share their insights on the subject. It's always great to be able to pull in experts like that. Again, if interested in our ongoing fundraiser to help get a few Ukrainian units some new pickup trucks, be sure to check out the link in the description as well as the pinned comment. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.